So it's a pleasure to be here to talk about economic aspects of demographic shifts in emerging markets. I'm an economist, so that's an appropriate topic for me to discuss. And I've been working on research related to the Chinese economy for many, many years now. And so that's the one country that I have the most expertise on. But I'm going to try to broaden the perspective to include other emerging markets as well. So when the population structure changes, there's a number of mechanisms through which it affects the economy. First, on the demand side, obviously, as Jack just described, people of different age groups and different education groups have different types of things that they like to buy and different types of services that they require. And so this is going to change the kinds of things that are going to be demanded. And this is why, not just in China, but everywhere, I think, healthcare, services for the elderly, long-term care, medical medicines, and other things that are going to attack problems faced by them are going to be huge growth areas for business. But then, of course, the total population growth matters in terms of its effect on overall economic growth, since most countries, even as populations grow, are able to maintain at least the same level of productivity of labor. So overall population growth matters for demand. But then there are these other mechanisms as well. One is consumption and savings. So China and most Asian economies are very high savings economies. The aging structure actually might lead to greater consumption and less saving because old people tend to be dissavers, right? They've saved a bunch and now they're dissaving, and the consumption is more than their incomes. Whereas, as Jack mentioned, the people who have not retired yet, they may be saving more in anticipation of a longer retirement period. So that, again, reinforces these effects on demand. But we care about savings as economists also because savings is often the source of funds that fuels investment. And, of course, there's a direct savings investment connection in terms of the high levels of investment that China has been able to finance to support high rates of economic growth historically. At the same time, if the economy becomes more open to international capital flows, which is happening, as we know here in Hong Kong very well, in China, then the connection between domestic savings and investment growth need not be so direct. If you can get, as China also has been successful doing, you can attract foreign direct investment and other investment flows, then what will matter more for investment is really the return on those investments, not necessarily the domestic savings. And I should add that these relationships between population change, population structure change, aging, and savings behavior is very imperfectly understood. There are many, and the main reason why it's imperfectly understood is many people, both in the US and developing countries, don't behave very rationally in terms of how they plan for their future. So there's huge kind of literature that shows that people don't save enough for retirement anywhere, for instance, and that consumption surprisingly tracks people's income much more strongly than you would expect if people were kind of planning very carefully for their entire future lifetime needs. And so there are many behavioral issues about how people actually behave in consumption and saving that kind of make it hard for economists using kind of very simple optimization models to predict or track. And finally, on the supply side, obviously the structure of the population is going to determine how many people are going to be working, and if you include education as an aspect of demographics, it's going to affect kind of the skill composition of the labor force as well. And this is going to directly affect what the economy can produce and how fast it can grow. And it can also have an interaction effect that the labor becomes a constraint for various types of projects and businesses, and so it affects the attractiveness of different types of investment or the returns to investment. So obviously it's complicated how all these different channels, but they're all going to be important. So let me talk about this idea of the demographic transition that Jack referred to in terms of this is a very central concept for economic demographers, and it describes a process that pretty much every country has gone through. And today's emerging markets are at various points along this continuum of time as it relates to this transition. It's pretty simple, actually. What happens typically in a traditional society poor society is that you have high death rates and high birth rates, and actually very low population growth rate because people are not living very well. And then, as countries develop and they establish better sanitation and public health and other things, the death rate falls first, okay? And then, after people become confident that their children are not likely to die and that mortality rates are very low and that the children will have long life, then the fertility rate then also drops. And eventually you end up in a kind of a steady equilibrium where you have very low birth rates and and much higher life expectancy. And typically these economies are aging societies or older societies. But this kind of difference in the timing of death rates and birth rates decline creates some interesting kind of phenomena as it relates to growth, right? So obviously, if birth rates stay high and people aren't dying as much, then this is the period where you see rapid population growth of the total population, right? But then what also happens as fertility declines, you get fewer younger people, and there still aren't that many old people. Then you end up getting what's called a demographic dividend, where the percentage of your population that's working is increasing over time. And that eventually runs out. So if you look at today's emerging markets in different parts of the world, you can see that if we look at the fertility rates, East Asia and Eastern Europe, Russia have pretty much completed the demographic transition in that fertility rates are now below replacement. Whereas in the rest of the major parts of the world, the fertility rates are still above replacement and probably declining. And in particular, you have Africa, where you have a very high fertility rate. So they're very early on in this process, right? If you look at longevity, lots of countries are making progress. The technology of public health systems and medicines, et cetera, has probably increased life expectancy for countries that at much earlier stages of development than in the past. And again, you have this outlier of sub-Saharan Africa, which has dealt with AIDS and other issues, which has kept life expectancy low. And as a result, the demographic differences are pretty striking for different parts of the world. Here you can see the places that have completed the demographic transition now are seeing stable overall population rates, maybe even will be declining. The working age population is going to start declining in East Asia. This is mainly driven by China, but actually many of the other countries in Asia who are even poorer than China are actually aging pretty fast, much earlier than kind of other countries in other places. And so this is what we're going to see. Whereas, wow, in Africa, there's going to be a 200% increase in the labor force up to 2050, and 131% increase in the population. So, this is real growth. This is going to drive real growth at the economy level. Economists are often much more interested in per capita GDP than overall GDP. But for businesses, depending on the business, the total GDP may also matter in terms of the growth of markets. And similarly, Muslim world, South Asia, also we're going to see big increases in total populations. And this is going to be important for, I think, businesses to understand going forward. So the two demographic dividends, there's this first dividend which I described, that as fertility declines, the labor force grows faster than the population. And because the laborers who are earning incomes don't have to support as many dependents as before, it also tends to free up resources that can be used for investment through savings. There's a second dividend that demographers have discussed, which describes the process where as countries become older, aging countries, that individuals may have a stronger incentive to make investments and save. Partly is that they have to support more years of consumption after retirement if they stick to conventional retirement ages. And partly it's the case that they know that with long life expectancy, if they make early investments in education, the payoffs are going to be much greater because that education is going to matter for many more years than if life expectancy were lower. But again, this, I think, second channel is less well established empirically because it depends on on what drives savings behavior in different countries. And we know there are big cross-country differences in savings behavior. And it can be strongly influenced by family support systems, government transfer systems that affect people's calculations and how much they need to save for themselves versus just rely on government or family when they get old. Okay. And if you look at this first dividend, about when does this share of the population that is working age, what are the patterns over time in different parts of the world? This is a really interesting figure because you can see that these shaded boxes are the projected peak levels of this productivity of the population, measured as the share of the population that's working. And you can see that in East Asia and Eastern Europe, Russia, we've passed the peak. So we're now going to see declining shares of the population working, and that's due to population aging, where again, in the other parts of the world, we're not there yet. We're still enjoying this demographic dividend, where more and more, a higher share of the population is working, especially in Africa, where it's not projected to peak until 3 decades from now. And so you can see as these percentages increase, this creates growth. It's been very important for China. People have estimated that it's contributed maybe 1.5% annually to growth in China up until the present day. And then the other thing, of course, it leads to big differences in population aging challenges. And you can see East Asia is now similar to Eastern Europe. Both are going to see very rapid increases in population aging, the share of the population that's above 65. This is going to be more modest in these other countries that have not completed the demographic census. So aging is not an issue at all in Africa for quite some time. Now I want to turn my focus to China and just describe a couple of the key demographic trends. And this has already been mentioned, so I'll say this quickly. The first big challenge is a shrinking workforce in China. You can see the growth rates in new labor is really passing zero. So the labor force is not going to grow. It's going to actually decline in absolute terms going forward. And on the one hand, it may help the government in China. It may put less pressure on them to maintain high growth rates to produce. So they don't have to produce as many jobs as before. That creates a little bit less political pressure to keep driving very high rates of growth. But at the same time, it does mean that there's going to be a scarcity of labor, that wages are going to continue to go up. They've been going up very fast in China. And as wages go up, we all know it becomes more costly to produce goods. And so we're already seeing the shift of production away from China to other countries. In some cases, interior parts of China where production costs are cheaper, but then shifting to Vietnam and other places as well. And then the second challenge is this aging challenge, which is the figure that, basically the same figure that Professor Goldstone put up earlier. So what are the main policy challenges of an aging society in China and elsewhere? Well, the two main policy programs that are intended to address the needs to support the well-being of older people are pension programs and medical care, long-term care programs. And for emerging markets, most of them have still somewhat immature government systems of support to meet these challenges. And you're going to see there's a lot of variation in how well countries are covering workers with pensions, etc. So just covering everybody, especially in these economies, many of them have very large informal sectors where people it's very hard for government to regulate participation in pension programs or other programs. So one key issue for pension program design is to make sure it doesn't discourage workers from working into older age. One reality that I think most populations, even in developing countries, have not come to grips with is that in the future, people are really going to have to work longer than in the past. It really doesn't make sense, especially as life expectancy continues to increase gradually. The systems won't be able to support people, living 30, 40 years in retirement and working the same amount of time. So that has to change. And another big policy issue is crowding out private support, which means that if the government is too generous in programs, it could lead families to say, oh, the government will take care of things, we don't have to. And they may reduce their own support and planning to provide that support to old people. So the medical care system has similar challenges. One is to just get coverage to the whole population, but also then, once you have coverage, providing a system that delivers good value for money and actually provides the services that are required to promote better health outcomes, that's not easy for developing and emerging markets. And then as you shift to a older population, the things that matter most for healthcare systems shift from kind of treating epidemics and these types of infectious diseases to really preventative care, identify chronic problems, diabetes, heart risk, etc. And those require a much more developed system of primary care physicians who are monitoring and are having more frequent contact with people. Okay, so I've been part of a large survey of the older population in China called the China Health and Retirement Longitudinal Study, CHARLES for short. And we produced a summary report for the first national baseline survey in China, which was a survey of 10,000 households, 17,000 people from throughout China, aged 45 and older. And so we tried to understand how well China is meeting these policy challenges. One thing we found, which got a lot of attention in the media, was that consumption poverty of the elderly was 23%, which is quite high and much higher than for the lower age group, 45 to 59. And so there are obviously some vulnerable old people in China today. We also have looked at the age profile of pension coverage in China, and I'm putting some comparative figures from other countries in Asia that were all part of a World Bank report on aging in East Asia. The China figure draws from our CHARLES data, and you can see that there's, for rural men and women, there's very low coverage of rural pensions, but for urban people, there's very high coverage. In fact, much better than most of the other countries, even better than Japan at the very older ages in terms of pension coverage. You can also see that across these other countries, there's a big variability in the coverage of pension programs. Thailand has introduced something which is closer to universal pension, social pension program, where everyone gets something. So you have high coverage rates, whereas Indonesia hasn't really dealt with this very much. Korea, again, has a big rural-urban split and still has a lot of people, especially at the oldest ages, who are not covered. Korea has one of the highest elderly suicide rates in the world. China also has a very high elderly suicide rate. And we found in the CHARLES survey that today's elderly in China have very poor physical health and high rates of depression as well. But some of the variance here deals with this problem of having informal economies. It's hard to set up pension programs when people are farmers or they're working in self-employment activities or private sector service activities that are not regulated, sometimes unregistered businesses. How on earth do you get these people to enroll in pensions? And this is why I think in some countries we're seeing a stronger move to providing social pensions, where the government basically says, okay, everyone above 60, you're going to get this amount, which is going to be enough to meet some basic level of welfare. And then, of course, employers can provide additional types of programs beyond that, but then at least we have a minimum coverage for all old people, and that gets financed through general revenues of the government, right? And so becomes part. And this also helps avoid some of the big incentive problems you have when you try to have this hodgepodge of multiple systems at the same time. So this is what China has had. It has a traditional kind of pension program provided by employers for urban people, which was well established under the social system. But then for rural people, because there's no employers, many of them are just farmers, they just have a kind of a social pension where everyone gets something after they're age 60, and they're expected to contribute if they're younger than 60, so they get this basic entitlement. But it's nothing to do with employers. This is a government transfer program, But the problem is that these two programs interact, right? They're very different. So a migrant worker coming to Shenzhen and working in a factory may say, well, I already have this pension in the rural areas. Why do I need the employer to give me a pension? So let's not enroll. So it frustrates the government in increasing the coverage and financing of the larger employer-provided systems. So this is another reason why it's really important to think carefully about the design of these programs. And here's the result of having different pension coverage rates for urban and rural. You see that in urban China, people are retiring much earlier. So this is just the percentage who are still working in the labor force. And you can see that especially for women in China, who often can retire at age 50 or 55, that at age 60, only 30% are working. Even at age 50 or 60 to 55, half of the women have stopped working, and men too. Whereas in rural China, people pretty much work until they drop, right? Until they can't really be productive on the farm, they continue to work. And so, urban China is like Europe and the U.S., and rural China is like Indonesia and rural and Africa and other places. So that creates a big challenge. The other thing we found in the survey that we did in China was that we can't assume that families are going to take care of all of the needs of old people. I mean, obviously we see there's a significant group of poor. In addition, we see that the percentage of old people receiving transfers from non-co-resident children is less than half. So many people aren't getting anything, and this is basically in the last year. Many of them are. If they are getting something, then the average amount is 1,700 renminbi per year, which is not a lot of money, right? In many cases, this is coming home at Spring Festival and giving a gift to their parents, but it's not what the parents necessarily rely upon. We do, however, find that for very poor old people, they tend to rely more on support from their families, and it really makes a difference for the very poor elderly. Without these gifts, the poverty rate would be even much higher than it is. But still, overall, there are many people who can't rely on their children for adequate support. And so this is just, there needs to be a lot more thinking into how to figure out who the people are who are vulnerable and poor and what the government can do to reach them. One big issue in China and many emerging markets is how to extend working lives of older people. This has, of course, real importance for overall economic output as well, and is what economists tend to spend a lot of time focused on. We hosted an online panel discussion of this issue with the World Bank late last year, and there were a lot of interesting points that were made. So let me just highlight a couple, and that also are supported by research. One is that for older people to work beyond age 60, 65, it really does require that they have sufficient education and health to continue to be productive at those ages. Today's elderly in China have very low cognitive function, poor physical health. They're unlikely, actually, to be able to work productively at very older ages. But the next generation will have much more potential, and increasingly so. So those early investments in health and education make huge differences in maintaining productivity of people as they reach retirement age. The second really important point is that pension systems have to be work neutral. So it's really important to end mandatory retirement systems that force very productive people who want to work and whose employers would like them to continue working, but somehow force them to stop working. That seems really a bad outcome both for the individual parties and also for the economy as a whole. So we care about this issue at universities in particular, where many productive faculty have to retire, even though I think they're still quite productive. No, everywhere, but especially in the closest to our kind of eyesight line, right? Kind of some of the defined contribution systems, like in the U.S., are actually pretty good at being work neutral. That you should be able to decide when to start taking your pension payments, et cetera, but that should be separate from when you decided to stop working, right? Then the other thing is that for older workers, systems need to provide probably a bit more wage and job flexibility than many currently do. obviously, sometimes older workers are declining in productivity. But if they have this wage that can never be lowered, then the employers are not going to keep them around. They'd rather have them retire and hire someone productive and new that they can train up. But if the employer, if they can shift to more flexible systems where you say, okay, you work less, you work from home, we pay you less, kind of thing, where there's some flexibility there, then it could actually provide a solution that would enable them to work longer. And of course, there's also many innovative investments that employers or firms can make to improve the productivity of their own workers as they get old. So there's some really famous examples. BMW plants in Germany, where they made some relatively cheap investments to make the workplace much more ergonomic, put less physical stress on the bodies of older workers. They've organized separate facilities for exercise classes and other things that would really support the health of the general health of their workers as they age. And these really raised productivity and allowed workers to work longer. And many employers maybe haven't fully grasped the potential for those types of innovations, and that could use government support in terms of information and maybe even financial support to encourage employers to do these types of investments. And then a big one also is just public education to try to shift people's expectations. So this actually became a real point of focus in our online discussion, where especially this expert from the World Bank was saying, the problem is that everyone still feels like they deserve to retire at age 60, age 65. And from very early on, they start planning around that. They start setting that as their expectation. And in the future, we really need to shift this kind of mentality if possible and prepare younger workers for the reality that in the future they're very likely going to need to work well beyond retirement age, or even try to make them want to work beyond retirement age, to realize that it can be a much more fulfilling life for various reasons that will maintain your cognitive function much longer if you continue to work and other things, so that people just feel like retirement is not at a fixed point, but at the time when it feels right for them, and they should think about lifelong learning. One important reason for this, obviously, one is it'll change the policy discussion about retirement ages and whatnot, but also if people expect that they're going to have to work, or that they would like to work into much older ages than has been typical in the past, then they will also make even more investments in their own human capital. And if they're a 45 or 50-year-old worker whose job is now threatened by new technology that makes their job their repetitive jobs kind of obsolete, they're going to feel like, well, I'm too young to stop, and they're going to say, what can I do? How can I retrain to still be productive? And that itself will then help them as well as the whole system continue to benefit from the productivity of their. And the last thing I want to mention is the healthcare system. Many of the issues are similar. One thing you can see in China from our survey is that health insurance coverage is now very good. Over 90% of people have health care insurance as of 2000. It's probably higher now. This was done in 2011-12. But there are other problems like underdiagnosis of key chronic conditions like hypertension. We found in our survey, because we actually did physical health exams and measured people's blood pressure so we could come up with a risk analysis for diabetes, and found that 44% of rural people and 30% of urban people were undiagnosed when they clearly were at risk of hypertension. And even those who were diagnosed, there were still 20%, 15% of people who were not getting any treatment for a diagnosed hypertension problem. So the system needs to do a lot better in designing a preventative care system that identifies these problems. And more generally, many of these health insurance policies, especially the rural ones, have very poor coverage. They still require high rates of copay. We found that many old people still don't want to go to the doctor because the copays are too high. So that many old people, especially in rural areas, basically are not getting much medical care when they have illnesses or other major problems. But it's step by step in China and many other emerging markets. I think the government has perhaps rightfully focused first on just getting people covered under different systems. And now they need to work next, I think, on trying to improve the quality of that coverage, integrate the multiple programs that exist, because actually having multiple programs creates very perverse incentives for workers in terms of how well they move across jobs and firms and regions. It really inhibits labor mobility. That's going to enhance the productivity of labor. And then on the healthcare, as I mentioned, probably preventative care. And a big issue, which isn't even really being discussed yet in China, is how to develop a system for long-term care. So in Asia, Japan and Korea now both have government-run long-term care programs. So that if you're an old person in these countries and you have difficulty doing basic things like getting dressed, bathing, going shopping, you will qualify for official support from the government, usually through subcontracted long-term care workers. And that doesn't exist even in many advanced countries. So it's possibly a model for addressing the needs of the elderly in other countries, including Hong Kong and China. So let me stop there, and thank you for your attention.